How would you feel if I told you that every household in America, including yours, has contributed nearly $861 towards the Ukraine war? That's right, your tax dollars are funding this conflict, whether you agree with it or not. Now, if you skip this video, you'll miss out on uncovering where that money goes and who benefits from it. But most importantly, I'm also going to examine whether all this aid we're providing is really worth it. And frankly, that's really not a simple yes or no answer. So my AI assistant, Tiara, she'll kick us off here. So Tiara, what do you think that we should discuss first?
Let's give a quick overview.
Okay, sure. So why has the US spent billions of dollars supporting Ukraine? Is it just about helping another country, or is there something bigger at play here? The US has been heavily involved in supporting Ukraine financially and militarily since Russia's invasion in 2022. And there are some key geopolitical reasons behind this. Now, at its core, the US sees this as more than just helping Ukraine. It's about protecting global stability and safeguarding its own national security interests. But here's where things get interesting. So, Tiara, what do you think is the problem with this approach?
All this support comes with a hefty price tag.
Exactly. And just how much has the US spent so far? And where exactly does that money go? Well, let's dive into breaking down the numbers. So since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the US has allocated approximately $183 billion in emergency funding for Ukraine-related efforts. This includes military aid, humanitarian assistance, and economic support. Out of this, about $130 billion has been obligated, and $86.7 billion had already been dispersed as of late 2024. But here's something interesting that you may not know. So even though we have already agreed to give this support to Ukraine, a lot of this money isn't actually leaving the US. In fact, roughly $58 billion has been spent domestically to replenish US weapons stockpiles or fund American defense contractors like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. This means that while the money is allocated for Ukraine, it's also boosting jobs and industries here in the United States.
That's great, Ron. But where does this money go once it's allocated?
Good question, Tiara. So let's just get right into that. So as I already said, the US has allocated nearly $183 billion in aid to Ukraine. And by the way, since you're already contributing to this war through your taxes, why not contribute to my channel too by subscribing? It's completely free. Unlike the taxes that you've been forced to contribute to a war that you may not necessarily agree with. But anyway, the $183 billion in aid is split into three main categories. So first is military aid, which is 67% of the funding. This is the largest chunk, and it's about $117 billion, and it's dedicated towards military support. This includes weapon systems like rocket launchers, javelins, anti-tank missiles, and ammunition for Ukraine's armed forces. It also covers, training programs for Ukrainian soldiers and maintenance of military equipment. Additionally, Presidential Drawdown Authority allows the US to transfer weapons directly from its own stockpiles to Ukraine. And so far, $24.9 billion has been sent this way. Second is the economic aid, which is 19% of the funding. That's about $34.8 billion, and that's been allocated through the Economic Support Fund to help Ukraine's government stay functional during the war. This funding helps pay salaries for public workers like teachers and healthcare providers, and supports rebuilding critical infrastructure like roads and power grids as well. It's also worth noting that some of this funding is channeled through international organizations like the World Bank to ensure transparency and effective use of the resources. And third is humanitarian aid, which is roughly 14% of the total funding. So roughly $25 billion has been spent on humanitarian efforts such as providing food, medical supplies, housing for displaced families, and support for refugees who have fled Ukraine. Now, to put this into perspective, overall, this funding is equivalent to less than 2% of the United States federal budget over the last 2 fiscal years.
Okay, but how do these numbers impact everyday US taxpayers?
Definitely a valid question, Tiara. So in total, this equates to about $861 per household based on the number of households in the US, which is approximately about 131 million. Now, while it might not seem like much when spread out over several years, it's still a cost that Americans are footing through their tax dollars. And more importantly, we're doing it at a time when things are far from perfect in our own country. Now, many critics argue that even small amounts like this really do add up, especially when Americans are facing rising costs at home. So whether it's, inflation, housing prices, or healthcare expenses. Public opinion polls show that nearly half of Americans are concerned about continued aid to Ukraine, particularly when domestic issues remain unresolved.
Oh, you mean people are upset that their taxes are funding foreign wars instead of fixing potholes? How shocking.
Yeah, you know what, Tara, that's really not far off at all. So the truth is, one of the biggest economic impacts of US aid to Ukraine is on the defense industry. So these companies have seen a surge in demand, leading to the creation of thousands of jobs across at least 38 states, with supply chains involving all 50 states. Beyond the defense industry, there are broader economic benefits tied to US aid as well. So by helping stabilize Ukraine and its agricultural exports, the US is indirectly addressing global food shortages caused by Russia's blockade of Ukrainian ports. Now, this has a ripple effect on global supply chains and helps prevent further spikes in food prices that would hurt American consumers at home. On the flip side, supporters of the aid point out that this spending is an investment in global stability. They argue that failing to support Ukraine now could lead to much higher costs for taxpayers down the road if conflicts escalate into larger wars involving NATO or other allies. So for example, the war on terror, that cost American taxpayers an estimated $3.6 trillion over 21 years, nearly 3 times as much annually as what's being spent on Ukraine. However, there are concerns about inflationary pressures tied to the spending. So critics argue that large government expenditures, whether domestic or international, can contribute to inflation by increasing demand in certain sectors faster than supply can keep up. But supporters counter that much of this spending is offset by long-term benefits like modernizing the US military and strengthening its industrial base. So while the immediate cost to taxpayers might seem manageable, the real debate is whether this spending is worth it in the long term. And that brings us to an important question. Tiara?
Is all of this aid really worth it?
Yes. So this debate is at the heart of US politics right now, and opinions are deeply divided. So on one side, supporters argue that aiding Ukraine is a strategic investment in global security and democracy. And on the other side, critics question whether this money could be better spent addressing issues at home. So let's examine both sides of the argument so that we have a full understanding. So first is the case for supporting Ukraine. So proponents believe that helping Ukraine isn't just about defending one country, it's about maintaining global stability, which directly benefits the US. So for example, by weakening Russia's military capabilities, the US reduces the likelihood of future conflicts involving NATO allies, which could be far more costly in terms of both money and lives. In fact, experts have pointed out that only 4% of the US defense budget has gone toward Ukraine aid, making it a relatively small price to pay for containing a major adversary like Russia. And there's also an economic argument to this, which is that much of the aid stays within the US, funding American defense contractors and creating jobs. Additionally, some argue that abandoning Ukraine could cause other adversaries, like China, for example, to act aggressively, potentially targeting Taiwan, which would have devastating consequences for global trade and US economic interests if that happened. And next is the case against supporting Ukraine. So critics, they argue that the US is spending too much money abroad while neglecting pressing domestic issues like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. A recent poll found that 52% of Republicans believe that the US is spending too much on Ukraine aid. And they point out that there's no clear end in sight to the conflict, which is raising concerns about an indefinite financial commitment. There's also skepticism about how effectively funds are being used. Now, some worry that corruption within Ukraine's government, which they are known for, by the way, could lead to misuse of aid.
Oh, please. Like the US would ever just throw billions of dollars into an overseas black hole without proper oversight. Oh, wait.
Yeah. Tiara, too soon. With the whole Doge thing and the government, just relax. Anyway, other critics question whether this spending is truly making a difference in ending the war or simply prolonging it. And public opinion reflects these divisions. So while 48% of Americans support continuing aid as long as it takes, this support varies widely along party lines. So 63% of Democrats back ongoing aid compared to only 37% of Republicans. And personally, I'm torn because I visited Auschwitz, which is a former concentration camp in Poland, when I was 30 years old, and that completely changed how I view conflicts like this. I promised myself that I'd never turn a blind eye when a smaller country is attacked by a larger aggressor. But at the same time, hearing about potential fraud with these funds and knowing over 1 million people have been killed or injured, it's infuriating, right? If cutting off US funding could require Ukraine to negotiate a ceasefire and save lives, it's hard not to wonder if that's the better path. In the end, whether you see this spending as necessary investment or a waste of money really depends on your priorities. And speaking of priorities, there's another issue that's draining America's resources as well. And if you think the cost of Ukraine's war is shocking, wait until you see how illegal immigration is impacting our economy. And you can do that by watching this video here. And if that one isn't for you, then check out this other video over here. And as always, thank you for watching, and make sure to drop a like and subscribe so that I can keep making videos like this.